And it is the Saturday Coffee Klatch with Heather Lofthouse and also our friend and colleague, Michael Lahanas Calderon. Something happened this week.
Oh, did it?
What can we talk about what happened? And each of you, from your own generational perspective.
So I want to talk about what happened and then what the big lesson is, right? What the big takeaway is, and what do we do next?
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Okay?
Let's go.
good.
3 topics. What happened? Michael, do you want to go first?
Do I? Not really, but I will. I think that the Democrats lost the presidency and the Republicans took the Senate. And as of this moment, it's looking likely that the Republicans will take the House as well, but that is still technically up in the air.
So it's a trifecta.
It is likely
And if
a
you
trifecta.
include the Supreme Court, it's a quadfecta. What is it?
Yeah, that.
A quadfecta?
Quadfecta.
Yeah, quadra nightmare.
What happens now? I mean, a lot of people are saying to themselves, particularly people who are Democrats and progressives, they're saying, you know, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Excuse
Oh
my
my
language.
gosh. Woo!
What are we supposed to do now?
And I agree with those feelings, and I have them too, and I have a lot of feelings going up and down, as I'm sure you all do as well. But I want it. Is reality really upside down? And let's discuss that, because I don't want everyone to overcorrect in a way that's overcorrecting.
It sounds like you think that it was not as much of a rout as
a flounce.
as it looks.
Well,
A shellacking.
yeah, I mean, it was horrific. Let's be really clear. It was, I think a lot of people are surprised, except some of the pollsters. Let's not go there. But I just don't want our reaction to be, I want it to be a right-sized strategic reaction.
I read over and over again, this is a fundamental historic realignment. I don't believe it. Do you, Michael?
I don't think so.
What
I
did
think
the stats say?
Well, I mean, if you look at the stats, certainly there was a lot more ticket splitting than I think has happened in previous elections, or at least in the way that people usually expect it. You had a lot of people voting for Democrats down the ballot who did not vote for Democrats at the top of the ballot. So this is why in all of the swing states, with the exception of Pennsylvania, the Democrat won the Senate race. So this isn't the clear-cut repudiation, quote unquote, of the Democratic Party that I think Republicans want it to be, but it still is a rejection of the Democratic Party as we know it in this moment.
What is
Right.
it, 100,000 votes-ish across 3 swing states?
Yeah, I mean, similarly tight margins to 2020 when Biden won in the blue wall states of Michigan,
Yeah.
Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
Michigan is a good way
I
of
would
putting
wish
it.
again the
Wish
whole
again.
thing over.
But let's just, I mean, if you're right, Michael and Heather, what you're saying is that we, by a hair, put him in 2016, by a hair, took him out and put Biden in, and by a hair, put him back in, Trump, in 2024. And we're dealing with the same tiny margins, and it's the same American people who did it every time. There's no fundamental change. Is that what you think?
I don't think it's quite so cut and dry, but on average, yes.
Yeah, when the numbers are fully in, pardon. Because as some people know, I don't think most people know, but California takes a very long time to count its votes. So the popular vote may look like a wide margin right now between Harris and Trump, but as those votes come in, it's going to look tighter and tighter.
So why and how did Trump win after losing last time by a hair or by more than a hair, however you want to slice it?
And also, people know how much of a loathsome, horrible, despicable character he is. How could America vote him back in after knowing that? After knowing that, unlike the first time, he is a criminal felon. He has been convicted on 34 counts. He has twice been actually impeached. He has found to be in a civil trial a sexual harasser, and the judge corrected that and said, no, he actually raped this woman. We know much more about him than the public knew in 2016, and yet, notwithstanding all of this, he's back in.
But I have to think that most Republicans, a lot of Republicans who voted for him don't like him. It's not about liking, it's not about respecting his moral character. Now, if you're someone who ignores that, that's a different conversation, but people are anxious, they are miserable, they are scared. I would say that I imagine many people, it's not that one party is the party of hope and the other one isn't. I think everyone is hoping for things to be better. And they looked at him and they said, I'm going to put my money on that guy.
Well, they did, obviously, but I thought Kamala Harris ran. I mean, she only had about 105 days. I mean, this is the most truncated campaign you can imagine. I thought she did a damn good job in those 105 days.
I know.
I mean, her debate performance was the best I've ever seen anybody. The Democratic convention could have been a disaster. It was actually beautifully done
Yep.
relative to the Republican convention, which was a hate fest. And then you also had the final message on the mall. She did a wonderful job on the ellipse. Donald Trump did a despicable, and the Republicans did a disgusting show in Madison Square Garden.
But it worked.
Well, why did it work? Why did it work? Is it because there's so much deep-seated misogyny and anger among young men especially? We saw a shift of Latino young men. What's the story with Latino young men? Latino young man. What's the story with Latino young men?
Well, I think as with most demographics, it's complicated. And the Latino demographic in particular is not a monolith, a sentence we hear a lot. There are a number of nationalities who have very particular ideas about what they want from policy. And like so many other voters, particularly working class Latinos, their primary concern is the economy. And I think we saw people say that over and over again in exit polls and in interviews, that they remember a version of the economy from 4 years ago, whatever our feelings may be about it, that to them felt better. And Democrats, I mean, in my opinion, didn't communicate effectively enough how they would improve upon what has happened in the last 4 years.
Let's talk about the economy. Let's drill deep into this notion of the economy. I agree with you. I think the economy was number one. I think it has been number one. It's been number one for 40 years. That's what people vote on more than anything else. But why didn't people feel that Kamala Harris and the Biden administration did the kind of job that we know they did? I mean, they did a very, very good job on the economy. But most people didn't feel that.
That's it. It's feelings.
Why didn't they feel it?
I know. Well, so, I mean, I was reading, so Kamala Harris, I always felt like she nailed all her speeches, and she did. But she didn't look into the camera in the way that Donald Trump did, somehow convincingly, and say, I see you, I hear you, and I'm going to make your life better. She was holding hands with a lot of celebrities, and I think people thought, that's not, you are an elitist, right or wrong, and I don't feel as motivated by you. I feel motivated by the nightmare.
Well, this is important because although the economy in objective terms is good, this elite versus non-elite, establishment versus non-establishment, college graduate versus non-college seems to be a huge issue, a huge framing factor in all of this. Do you agree?
I agree. And I think you both were talking about this on this very podcast not a few weeks ago. You were expressing concern that the Harris campaign was being seen as the establishment from left to right with celebrities and so on.
When you get the celebrities and you get, the Cheneys and Dick Cheney. I mean, I was even asking myself, do I want to vote for somebody who's been endorsed by Dick Cheney? I did, but
Republicans didn't. If you look at the numbers, 96% of registered Republicans voted for Trump this time and last time in 2020.
And most of them, again, were concentrated in the non-college male sector of all of these different ways of dividing up the electorate. So what is it about, particularly non-college, particularly the anti-establishment vote? Why did it go for Trump? Why didn't it go? Is it just sexism, misogyny, racism?
No, that's part of it, but it's not just that.
Well, I'd add, I mean, as just a data wrinkle for all of the narratives that people are going to be peddling in the next couple of weeks, that, I mean, we are in the middle of a global anti-incumbent trend. Governments across the world have lost vote share in each of the elections that they've participated in, and often lost. So the Harris campaign was fighting against very strong headwinds, mostly because of the pandemic and inflation that people remember, that maybe they just couldn't swim against entirely.
But also, it's also around the world, it's also immigration. And the question you're saying, I mean, you describe it as anti-incumbent. Could it be described as anti-establishment, anti-elite? Is there kind of a groundswell in the United States and elsewhere against the forces that seem to have power?
Mm-hmm.
It is, but I have a problem with the discrepancy between reality and messaging. So Biden and the Biden administration and Biden-Harris were incredibly pro-working class policy-wise. I mean, you cannot deny it. And we did the soft landing, even though inflation was incredibly high. He showed up and shook hands with union members on picket lines that had never been done before. There were the child tax credit. I mean, so infrastructure
And
all over the place.
antitrust, anti-monopoly.
Big time antitrust. I mean, all these things did happen. It was very pro-working class as far as the government goes.
But people didn't feel it.
I know.
Particularly, again, the non-college working class. And Latino men and even a lot of black men started moving toward the Republicans.
So it's messaging around the presidential campaign. Is it messaging the entire time Biden was in office too? And now we have to look forward and think about this for the midterms? I mean, it's just a constant message gap.
Well, let's hold off on where we go in the future. But let's just focus on this. If it is a wave of anti-establishment anger, what then? What should the Democrats do? What should the Democrats have done?
Also, you called this 30 years ago. Can we watch?
Exactly 30 years ago.
Exactly.
Almost to the day.
Yeah. Let's watch.
My friends, we are on the way to becoming a two-tiered society, composed of a few winners and a larger group of Americans left behind, whose anger and whose disillusionment is easily manipulated. Once unbottled, mass resentment can poison the very fabric of society, the moral integrity of a society, replacing ambition with envy, replacing tolerance with hate. Today, the targets of that rage, and we see it around us. You can only read the daily paper. You don't have far to look. Today, the targets of that rage are immigrants and welfare mothers and government officials and gays and an ill-defined counterculture. But as the middle class continues to erode, who will be the targets tomorrow?
They didn't follow my
They didn't
direction.
listen.
They didn't listen.
And your messaging was good.
I've been saying the same thing for 30 years.
And it's 30 years exactly this month, November 22nd.
Well, thank you very much for recognizing that.
I
Michael.
know, but really, okay, so if that's the messaging gap, why haven't they polled and then changed the message?
Well, the easiest answer is because the Democrats are dependent on the same money that the Republicans are. They drink at the same trough. They're not going to bite the hands that feed them. And that message is very much about, the distortions in our system that come about because you have huge money. When I said this in 1994, we hadn't got nearly to the huge money we have now, but huge money that is in control of the system and that is actually distorting the system in favor of and rigging the system in favor of the people at the top and against average working people.
You weren't even born when he did that speech, were you?
No, I was not.
No, but I knew you were coming along, Michael.
You were hopeful that
Omniscient
Michael
about
would,
that.
Yeah.
Well, and I
Well,
mean,
you were born. Were you around?
Yeah, of course.
I never
In
heard from
94?
you. I never heard from you. You
I
could
was
have written
busy.
a little note.
I was playing basketball. It was my junior year in high school.
to bring it back for a second, I think the establishment point continues to be interesting to me as it relates to Trump specifically, because again, I've been reading a lot of these postmortems and interviews with voters, and even among in any case, Andy Kim, who was first Korean American elected to the Senate from New Jersey, was talking earlier this week about how he talked to a lot of Trump voters after 2016 and after 2020, and what he was hearing over and over again is even after 2020, they did not view him as an establishment figure, even though he had been president, because the establishment continued to reject him and go after him, or whatever you want to say. And I think that continued through 2024. Like, the average person who votes only in presidential elections, the low propensity voters, as the statisticians might call them, they see Trump the businessman, they see Trump the renegade, Trump they're going after me and they're trying to get me over, and and he was never fully accepted. So he could run on being anti-establishment despite being the epitome of the established interests.
In fact, every time he outraged the establishment and outraged the New York Times and the Washington Post, he got more votes every time people, editorial writers and commentaries, people who are on MSNBC or wherever would say, I can't believe a president of the United States would do this and say this, or a former president of the United States. People thought he is maybe on my side.
That's also the psychology of conflict, like lowercase c. I mean, people are it's reality TV. He's from reality TV, and you get that dopamine hits, and you're like, I can't believe
He's
this.
the heel, right?
Yeah, we're stuck in this cycle where it's like, I mean, it can't. He's doing it again, so therefore.
But if he's doing it again and again, and he's outraging the establishment, and I feel that I am not part of the establishment, and I resent the establishment, and I feel like the establishment has demeaned me and taken my status away, taken my jobs away, I'm going to say, well, he's my man.
I know.
So then how do Democrats run as the anti-establishment candidates forthcoming? Or how could they have this year?
Well, it's interesting. Interesting you ask. Because in 2015, before Donald Trump really was a power, I was out in the Midwest, and I was also in Missouri.
Wow.
And North and South Carolina. I was doing kind of field work for a book I was writing at the time, doing groups, kind of focus groups, and I would ask people, who do you find attractive for president? Now, this is 2015. This is a time when the Democrats had all but decided that it was going to be Hillary Clinton and it was going to be Jeb Bush. Remember those days?
I remember Jeb.
And people would say back to me, all across the country, working class people, but multiracial, it didn't matter whether women or men, they said, we like two people, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And I said, and many times the same person would say Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. I said, why? Because they're not politicians, and they are authentic.
Yep.
And they are outside the system, and they will shake the system up. Shaking the system up, being authentic, being outside the system, not being career politicians, were the most important things on people's minds. And I think that is exactly what's
Even
continuing.
if your authentic self is horrendous, it's like, but kudos for being authentic.
But if you are horrendous, and if you're horrendous and you make the establishment crazy, maybe that's what is attractive. I don't think most people in this country who voted for Donald Trump are bigoted in terms of being, racist and sexist. And I don't think that was attractive to most people. I think most people said, despite the fact he's pretty awful, I'll vote for him because he's on my side.
Yeah, but even that is a problem. I mean, even if, benevolent sexism is still sexism, right? I mean, you can't just be, I don't know. It is, and I'm a privileged white woman who lives in California, right? So I have it easy. But I agree that we have to, I don't want to demonize everyone who voted for Trump.
No,
because
that's exactly the opposite of what I'm saying.
I know it's the opposite of what you're saying. I think this is so critical because I think in this potential overcorrection with all these feelings, which are justified, we have to be so careful about where we're placing the blame.
Well, remember, an explanation is not a justification.
Yep.
And so what we're trying to do is explain.
Yep.
And I think the most powerful explanation is, and the consistent explanation,
Yep.
is this anti-establishment,
Yep.
huge feeling
And
that comes up from 40 years of stagnant wages and
know.
feeling like the game is rigged, and it is rigged.
And could I ask a question then?
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like the discourse right now is Democrats are going after each other. And I think that lots of people in the Democratic universe are saying, well, we tried all of these pro-worker policies and they turned against us. We should just throw it in the garbage bin. But if I'm hearing what you're saying and what you've written on Substack and elsewhere, it's absolutely the opposite, right? You can't give up on this because it's fighting against decades of this, anti-worker sentiment, movement, policies, politics, all of it, and it's not going to be fixed in one term, right?
Yeah.
Michael, I was part of an administration. I was very proud to be part of the Clinton administration. I was a cabinet member in the Clinton administration, but that was an administration that embraced NAFTA and Chinese ascension to the World Trade Organization and deregulated Wall Street, got rid of the basic 1930s acts that would have separated and did separate investment from commercial banking, said to Wall Street, go ahead, do whatever you want, and put antitrust and monopolization on the back burner and said, big companies, you want to merge, go ahead. I mean, and did not actually move toward labor law change and reform of a sort that would make it easier for people to unionize. And so in 1950s, 35% of the private sector workforce was in a union. Now it's 6%. You see, workers have no power. So obviously the working class is going to go with somebody who is anti-establishment and looks like he's just pissing off everybody who is rich and famous and notable. And
may I toss a data wrinkle into that point?
Yeah.
I think it still supports it, but I found it really fascinating that they were saying, or statisticians and pollsters were saying, Harris did better with union voters, union workers, than Joe Biden did. Partly, I assume, in part because of the policies that they've passed in the last 4 years, but it didn't make enough of a difference because what percentage of the working population is in a union? It's tiny. And it couldn't counteract the fact that you have a lot of other working class people who did not necessarily, in their eyes, directly benefit from that, or they couldn't see it because it hasn't happened yet.
So what about all the people who are now from centrist casting, who are saying, what are we going to, okay, here we go. What are we doing in 2028? It's got to be Gavin Newsom. It's got to, people are just in this gripping so tight, and they're like, we got to move to the center. I mean, how is that the takeaway?
The Democrats always, every time they lose, this is what was 1994, the great loss of the House and the Senate in 1994. They said, we have to move to the center. There is no center. What does a center mean? And particularly if you're dealing with fascism on one side and democracy on the other side, do you want to compromise? Is that a center? Is there a workable center between fascism and democracy? No, there's no. What you have to do is you've got to be on the side of most working people. 90% of Americans have lost job security. The median wage of the bottom 90% over the past 40 years has increased 15% in real terms, adjusted for inflation. Wall Street has done wonderfully well. CEO pay used to be, when in the 60s and 70s, when I first looked, it was 20 times the average worker. Then it became 50 times the average worker. And then CEO pay right now is 320 times the average worker.
So why didn't Kamala Harris say that?
That's the question.
Dun, 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 dun.
Why didn't she say that? Why did she move? Actually, Joe Biden came up with a pretty good tax plan to start, raising taxes on capital gains. She moved in the direction of the center. She moved against that.
And she had surrogates like Mark Cuban out there saying, if she tries to tax unrealized capital gains or this or that, I would campaign against her. Of course she's not going to do this.
She had billionaire surrogates who were saying, let's get rid of Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission because she's too aggressive on antitrust. This is the Harris campaign, we're not talking about with the Trump campaign, we're talking about the Harris campaign.
So her big lean in on populist economics was, I am going to stop price gouging for groceries. I heard her say that a number of times. But in terms of messaging, does anyone know what price gouging for groceries really,
I don't like that. It sounds like you're gouging groceries.
But really, it's like, I'm going to lower prices for you because you are hurting and there are people who are taking the money from you. That's your point, that the narrative has to be so
The narrative
clear.
has got to be clear. Big corporations have huge power in our society, economically and politically. And economically, they have kept up their margins, their profit margins, and they've kept their prices up. And very wealthy people like, say, Elon Musk, have huge political power. Is there any question anymore about that? And what you have got to do is campaign on the side of average working people, not on the side of the big corporations and the wealthy.
I think we can't underestimate, too, the pandemic. It's not being talked about as much as I would think. I feel like if we look back, assuming we all live for thousands of more decades, the pandemic was so isolating for so many people financially, but also it allowed the internet to just grow, and all of these micro networks online and these parasocial relationships, all of it kind of started. And we cannot, the information system is broken, but we are fighting something very big. We are fighting a disinformation system and people who are wedged into their corners. People are lonelier than they ever have been, and the sense of community. How do we bring that back? Because I think that will help Dems as well.
Heather, don't you think that question and the answer to that question is part of what we're talking about right now? That is, people are lonely and fragmented and fractured, and they are susceptible to demagogues, and they are susceptible to lies on social media and these platforms and on X, because they really don't have an alternative. They're not being told the real narrative. Nobody is saying to them what's really happening.
Yep.
And so they're susceptible to a narrative that says, well, your real enemies are immigrants, or your real enemies are transgender people, or your real enemies are, there's a void here that Democrats need to, or somebody needs to fill in terms of saying what's actually happening. Who has the real power? And who, because they have the real power, has been causing so many people to feel insecure and angry.
I think
and
people
upset.
feel like they're in a support group. If we're all listening to Joe Rogan together, and it's like there is a system of support. And I feel like we need to create something where people feel like they're fighting something besides Donald Trump.
And they're together.
Exactly,
And
they're together. But so we have to have another villain, and there is one.
Yes.
It's big corporations and the rich, right?
Well, a villain in the sense that they have abused
Messaging.
their power. And yes, there used to be things that brought people together called political parties. And the Republican Democratic and Republican Party in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I lived through it, there wasn't much there. But Donald Trump created a MAGA Republican Party that felt like, it had its own hats, it had its own emblems, it had its own music.
Events.
It felt like a club you were joining. Why can't Democrats, the anti-establishment Democrats, create something that is a real club, something that you really join, that is, yes, anti-big corporate.
Remember the Bernie Bros?
Well, Bernie came very close.
I know.
Yeah. It's funny. I'm just thinking, there's a documentary that you were interviewed for not a couple weeks ago that I think it was the BBC did. And one of the people they talked about was somebody from Ohio who was a member of Trump's Front Row Joes. And it's just this group of people that would go and sit in the front row of Trump rallies all across the country. And they'd become friends, and they'd forge these social connections, exactly like you're saying. And I cannot imagine any version of that happening with the Democratic Party as it existed this cycle. I really can't.
No, how can you think of that? You're joining some club of people who are like you and have the same feelings when it's Mark Cuban, and it's the celebrities from Hollywood, and it's the billionaires.
But I know a lot of people that went around to different states and volunteered and felt like she is bringing us back to where we were. She's fresh, she's new, she's smart. Really, we can't paint with too broad of a brush.
Absolutely. I think, and I want to say it again, I think she did a beautiful job. I was moved. It was the best debate performance I've ever seen.
I know.
And that's, over 70 some odd years. But the first debate was actually 1960. But what we're talking now is something different from Kamala Harris's in her 105 days. We're talking on a different level. We're talking about the structure of the economy and politics. We're talking about what Democrats in the future must do in terms of filling the void that is now being filled by hate by the haters.
But we cannot let people become cynics. So we can't say the Democrats have failed entirely and no one wants to go to a party that Kamala throws. You
That
know
is
what?
a Democratic Party.
I would,
Right.
but
The life
just
of the party.
To follow up on that point, I mean, but that's so specific to Trump, right? You wouldn't see front row Joes for Mitt Romney,
Right.
Or your typical person that you'd run on the Republican ticket. And I personally believe, and I hope, knock on wood, that in the post-Trump era, even if he tries to appoint an heir, it's so specific to him. And that's reflected, I think, in the data, like of the down ballot races who were not Trump, even the people who emulated Trump, they couldn't do it.
Also, he hasn't been on social for 3 days. He likes the winning. He's not a good president, leader, businessman. He
not-
was so unpopular. So
We know that. We
We're
know
s-
that.
I know.
We know that. We also know something else, and that is it's very likely that Republicans are going to be in control of not just the White House and not just the Senate, but probably also the House. And we know that they're also, let's face it, in control of the Supreme Court. So the fact that they're in control of everything, they own it. I mean, what happens that is a disaster for the economy, and by the way, those tariffs are going to be a disaster for the economy, and mass deportations are going to be a disaster for the economy. This disaster is going to be owned by the Republicans. They have no excuse.
God willing, I feel like they'll deflect like no tomorrow.
Well, they will, but this is the opening. This is the opportunity for Democrats to do a kind of fundamental pivot.
So how do we do it?
So how do we do it?
Well, we do it. We start right here with us three,
Great.
and all of you out there,
Right.
Right. You're part of this. You're part of this, and we build a new foundation, and it may not be completely built by the time I'm gone, but
You've been
Michael,
fighting for
you're
years.
young
Yeah, it's
enough.
up to you,
okay,
Michael.
great. I'll
You will
handle
carry
it.
this gone.
Well,
You
no,
handle
but
it.
I mean, in a sense, this is a very small example audience, but Bob, you're right. I mean, we've got to build communities and social connections among the people who care about democracy and human rights and progressive economics, populist economics, whatever you want to call it.
And social justice.
And
I mean,
social justice.
These are not pie in the sky ideas, and we have a history. You know, I am old enough. You know, this is a theme here, age.
I know.
I'm going to come back
I
to this
mean,
theme in a minute.
It's
But
a
I'm
theme
old enough
for
to
everyone,
remember.
always.
I remember I didn't live through the 30s, but my parents did,
Mm-hmm.
and I heard about the 30s, and I know about Franklin D. Roosevelt, and I read his speeches, and he created a coalition, not perfect in any way. I mean, he excluded black people from a lot of that coalition, but it was a coalition of the working class and a coalition of the downtrodden and people who felt that they were getting a bad treatment, that the game was rigged against them by the economic royalists, by the big corporations, by the captains of industry. And what he said, Franklin D. Roosevelt, again and again, and I was reminded of it this morning, his final discussion, his final speech in 1936, in which he said, "They hate me. They and I relish their hatred. They, the captains of industry, the big corporations, the people with power in this economy, they hate me." Well, that's what we need.
But we had it, so now we have to do it again.
We have to do it again. And on the theme of age, I just want to say that we have 2 birthdays coming up. We have Michael, your birthday. You're going to be, I don't even want to say 28.
Oh.
Michael, you are 50 years younger
No.
than I am.
My gosh.
Talking across the ages. No wonder I have
The
no
age
idea.
is represented by this amount of table space.
That's right.
50 years.
And today is the birthday. Today is Heather's birthday.
Also 28.
Also 28. And I think we ought to raise our glasses
Oh,
and give
thank you
both
for that.
Michael and Heather a huge celebratory
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, can we get down to business? I'm not big into birthdays.
Oh, you have more business.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yes.
my just on the what are we going to do? I want to be a little more specific. I don't want to, we have to mobilize and not get cynical. Okay, great. Did that. Check. Like we're here. What else can we do? Are we looking for wins at the state level? Are we looking for what are some other levers? And what is our next big tentpole moment? Is it the midterms or is it before then?
Well, the midterms, and I think we do have to mobilize and organize. I think a lot of people out there, a lot of you are going to go, "Oh, I can't." Well, yes, we have to get our strength back first, but we've got to mobilize and organize for the 26 midterms, and then there are a lot of states where, like California, where we can do a lot and preserve and protect what we value, including women's rights and the rights of people who have worked very hard and played by the rules and are parts of our communities who are now going to be in danger because of a mass roundup of people who are accused of being here illegally, and the families of these people who are in danger of being broken up. And we have a lot of people who are political opponents of Donald Trump who have every reason to be worried right now. And we have to protect them, and we've got to enshrine the notion that dissent is going to be invited and protected in our society, and we can do that personally, every one of us.
Could I add some statistical silver linings to that very
Yes,
beautiful,
please.
passionate, emotional appeal?
Yes, please
Well,
do.
I mean,
You youngin'.
my youngin'.
Yeah.
You little shrimp.
Also, messaging, statistical silver
I
linings.
know, this is what
I know,
us,
this is-
those
you
on the
just-
left. No, but in all seriousness, I mean, if you look at the down ballot races, even beyond the Senate, Democrats broke GOP supermajorities in a handful of states. They retained legislative majorities in places like Pennsylvania just by like a seat. They are competitive in Trump-leaning districts on the presidential level. This is not like 2016 where everybody down ballot was wiped out with Trump. It is not even, to some degree, like 2020. It is a really solid foundation to build on for the next year or two. And I think that makes me personally feel a little bit better this week to know that even if there was an embrace of Trump at the presidential level, everywhere else, people were willing to say, I will still vote for a Democrat, and I will still vote for populist economics or paid family leave. I mean, look at the the ballot initiatives. You had minimum wage increases, abortion protection amendments, and paid family leave things passing in places like, let me pull out my piece of paper that tells you the exact states: Arizona, Colorado, Maryland.
Paid family leave in Arizona?
Sorry, abortion amendments in Arizona, Colorado, Maryland, Montana, and Nevada, overturning an abortion ban in Missouri.
Not Florida, unfortunately.
Voters in 2 states, Alaska and Missouri, approved ballot measures to raise the minimum wage, and Nebraska also approved a ballot measure giving workers the right to earn paid sick leave as part of that. So you've got a number of what many people would view as ruby red states embracing populist economics and social welfare.
I think embrace is more accurate there than embracing Trump. I would like to think that many people who voted for Trump didn't do it because they like him. They did it because they thought it was the option that would help them economically better. Whether that was uninformed or to them informed, I just want to be clear that one of the reasons I'm staying hopeful, saying and staying hopeful.
Saying and staying, yes.
Yeah, is because I don't think it's a full embrace. I think people are panicked, and they're not all showing up at the events. I have to think that.
Well, I think, Michael, what you just went through, I mean, to have paid sick leave pass in Nebraska, for example, and all of those abortion changes and amendments and statutes that give women the rights over their bodies that they deserve. Even in Florida, they had that proposition in Florida that did not pass. It didn't pass because in Florida you had to have 60%. It got 57%. Well, if it were a majority, that would have passed. In other words, it's not a failure. So what we're saying is that there is alive and well in this country a very dramatic, powerful, populist economic movement. And if the Democrats nationally knew what was good for them, they would, and what was good for most of us, they would embrace that as well.
Definitely. If that populist economic brand or that progressive social welfare brand that passed in these states can be tied to the party, it's a whole different ballgame.
Well, on that very positive, progressive note, I feel better than when we sat down together. Thank you for that.
Yeah, same.
Thank you for that. And
Still a lot to work through.
yes,
Let's be
still a lot-
honest.
Listen,
Let's be honest.
I think this is an opportunity for me to kind of summarize. I want to thank both of you and congratulate both of you on your birthdays.
Thank you.
And my birthday is not for a while, but what I want to say to all of you, quite sincerely, is that, number one, you are not alone. You may feel like you are alone right now. And a lot of you, particularly you in towns and cities and red states, you're feeling more alone than you've felt in years. But you are not alone. In fact, if what we are saying is the case, most America is with you. Working Americans are with you. What we have to do is regenerate the ideals that actually animated the Democratic Party before. And we've got to make it real to people. We've got to help people in terms of kitchen table economics. You know, the cost of living, things that everybody is concerned about. Secondly, please, and Heather has said this repeatedly, don't become cynical. It's easy right now. I mean, many of you, and I've talked with many people, and many people I've worked with over the past 20 years, they just are shocked and depressed, and they say, well, you know, this country is not the country that I thought it was. I understand that cynicism. And certain times over the last, 4 days, I've felt it as well. But just remember, the only way we get back, the only way we get positive change in this country is if we overcome cynicism and we get on with the business of rebuilding what must be rebuilt in this country. And I'm talking about the power of average working people and the power of most Americans. And so don't be cynical, because what they want, what the billionaires, and it is billionaires who are taking over the country right now, and the plutocrats and the oligarchs, what they want more than anything else is for the rest of us to become cynical so they can have it all. And they almost do have it all. But we now have an opportunity to take it all back. So again, don't feel alone. Don't feel cynical. And give yourself a little break now. You've been working very, very hard. We've been working very hard. We're all going to take a little bit of a break. We're all going to be back next week.
It's called the weekend.
But
Yes.
We're going to take the weekend. But be nice to yourself. Be kind to yourself. We will get through this. I promise you we will. I also want to thank our loyal technician, Jordan Alpert, who's right over there. You don't see him, but Jordan has done a wonderful job making sure that we can be here for you. And we will continue.
See you in a
We will
week.
continue. See you all next week.